Hi there. My name is Dan Klyn, and I'm an information architect, and it makes me incredibly nervous to call myself that in front of all of you. And that's part of the reason why I wheedled my way into this keynote today was because of this combination of terror and confidence that I have about information architecture and the opportunity to talk about it with you all. And as my introduction pointed out, I teach information architecture at the what used to be the library school at the University of Michigan. And I started a company about a year and a half ago that does information architecture exclusively. And before any of you start to feel threatened by information architecture, here's a graph of the interest of Google users over time since about 2004. The blue line is architecture, and the flat, mostly flat line is information architecture. So you are not threatened at all by information architects. And this little mountain here was when I started getting interested in architecture. The volume of my searches alone was registered by Google. This is filtered for Michigan, so I'm pretty sure that that was me. And the reason that I started all of this research into what you all do is because of something that happened at an AIA national meeting in 1976. Were any of you in Philadelphia in 1976? Okay. That's too bad, because I have yet to find anybody other than Mr. Wurman, Richard Saul Wurman, who you may have started to hear about again. If you've heard about Mr. Wurman, it's probably because he invented the TED conference. And many of us rely on TED for the graduate degrees that we never went and pursued. We just watch these marvelous TED Talks. And so if you know about Richard Saul Wurman, who invented information architecture, you probably know about him because of his invention of TED. And he is indeed quite dashing and sassy, as Mrs. Obama discovered when she honored him at the White House recently. Just on Monday, this is a photograph of Mr. Wurman at University College in Dublin, Ireland. He was given the James Joyce Award there, but not for architecture. He was given this award for his contribution to letters and rhetoric, again, because of the invention of this TED conference. So, 1976, this thing that Mr. Wurman did that has totally changed my practice as an information architect was invented in 1976 at an AIA meeting, and the impact that Mr. Wurman has had in architecture. This is the slide where I would put that, if there was some, but there really hasn't been. And so part of what I'm excited about today is reintroducing architects to this thing that was invented at your national meeting. I can go backwards, I guess I can. In 1976, called the Architecture of Information. So the stuff that goes there. And so information architecture, if you've heard of this, this is probably where you've heard of it. The people who you know who work on websites and apps and things might have this O'Reilly book on their shelf with a polar bear on the cover. And for most people, in most contexts, if you were talking about information, we'd be talking about this, which is designing large-scale websites. And the impact that Mr. Wurman's work on information architecture from back in the 70s and back into the 60s, the impact that it has had, and the ability to see that in a community of practice is only a little bit better with the librarians who turned into web designers. So this thing that Mr. Wurman did in Philadelphia in 1976 is both fairly unknown to architects and fairly unknown to information architects. So I volunteer on the board of an institute. You all are the members of an institute. Our institutes together, I think, would benefit from knowing something about this body of work from 1976. So I would like to reintroduce you to this thing that you have dibs on, actually, because it came from your community, the architecture of information. And there are going to be 5 things. So as you get bored, as your lunch turns your attention into sleep, watch for where we are. I have had the enormous good fortune of being in the right place at the right time relentlessly throughout my life. And one of the right place, right time things for me was being in Ann Arbor, teaching at the School of Information in 2009. The art school brought Mr. Werman to town to give a talk, again, not because he's an architect, but because of his sort of contribution to what we all care about because of TED. And the School of Art was the title sponsor, so it said University of Michigan School of Art, and then in little tiny letters, the School of Information. My department was a co-sub-sponsor. And just like I wheeled my way into this room with you today, I asked the chairman of my department, hey, we're a sub-sponsor of this thing. Is there a fancy afterglow? Is there a dinner? Is there some sort of cocktail thing that I can get into because I'm... And sure enough, there was. And it was dinner after his talk at a very small restaurant in Ann Arbor. There were 2 or 3 other people from the art department there, and me. And because I had that little spike in the graph, I'd been studying this man for a very long time. I knew he was left-handed, so I sat immediately to his right, and I monopolized him for the whole meal, and have developed a friendship with Mr. Werman. And this was important to me because evidence of what he did with information architecture, you couldn't get it. So I had all this stuff I needed to ask him. So I needed to wheedle my way into his confidence, which I did. And so I asked him, 1976, this conference, the Architecture of Information, well here, I'll play a recording of it. So my first question is, back in 1976, did you intend to create... Okay. My question was, back in 1976, did you intend to introduce this concept to architects? And that was about as far as I needed to get. In 1976, did you intend for this to be, you're the chair of the conference, you've got all of your colleagues there, did you want to give them something that they would go and do? Because they haven't gone and done anything. And his response was, no, I never do anything for anyone but myself. And the architecture of information was what he calls a pattern that he was interested for himself. And so, because he was the chair of the conference, he got to indulge his interest in this thing called the architecture of information. And I had a graduate student track this down. This is the advanced program that they sent out a direct mail piece to you all, if this was you back then, encouraging you to come to Philadelphia for this national meeting. And in reading through this, and then this picture over here is a picture of the keynote fable that was performed at this conference. If you open up the advanced program, it talks about, so here's a little illustration, and there's going to be a keynote fable called What If Could Be, an historical fable of the future, presented in the opening ceremonies of the conference. So rather than a keynote speech, there was going to be the performance of a keynote fable. And the venue for this performance was an old armory in Philadelphia. And in the run-up to this conference, the AIA magazine ran an interview with Mr. Werman. And this is the place where you would first learn that, in fact, Mr. Werman is role-playing. And he is creating a character called the Commissioner of Curiosity and Imagination. He gives most of the interview with his back to the interviewer, channeling the character of this Commissioner of Curiosity and Imagination, and then turns around at the end. Here is a photograph from the artifact, and through the magic of the internet, I secured one of these. This was what you got if you attended a printed copy of this keynote fable. And this little guy, the commissioner, looks like Mr. Werman, a little fat guy with a beard who says lots of things that make people uncomfortable. Here's a little bit more of the imagery from this artifact, which you can examine afterwards if you'd like. And I sure wish I could talk to somebody who was there. I would love to know how you perform a keynote fable. Like, what does the audience do? What does the performer enact? But all we have is the words, and I would like to read a couple of those for you, to get a sense of the personality of this commissioner of curiosity and imagination. So the commissioner has been walking around, and the commissioner is in a city, a town called What If, in the land of Could Be, which is a metaphorical framing of Philadelphia is the city, and the United States is the place. And so he is walking around the town of What If in the land of Could Be, and then when he meets some of the citizens, he says, when I arrived, they didn't seem to have reserved any office for me, so I thought I'd just make the whole city my office. And I started to walk around and look a little, and well, there do seem to be a few problems. What do you mean problems? The mayor's aide asked. That's a good question, the commissioner answered. Just to start at the beginning, when I got to the airport of Could Be, right there you could see a problem. Or in any other airport in What If, for that matter. I had no idea where I was. I didn't know if I was 10 miles from the city or 10 blocks. And I didn't know what the city is shaped like, or where I was going, or where in the city I was going, where that was, or what was the best way to get there. So you could say that when you get to the airport or the train station, you don't know how to get where you're going unless you've already been there. Then when I was taking my walk, I talked to a lot of people, and it's pretty clear there are other problems. Dirt, traffic, pollution, parking, education, crime, broken streetlights, one sign after another whose only purpose seems to be to confuse you, deteriorating neighborhoods, boring streets, parks and plazas where there's nothing to do, and where even the benches are uncomfortable. I got lost, rained on, splashed by trucks, I almost got robbed, I almost even broke my neck tripping over a curb. Now, as I said, everybody's got a pretty good idea of what the problems are, and they're certainly not shy about telling me. But the difficulty seems to be that nobody really knows how to say what the real problems are. It's as though there are only two words in everybody's vocabulary, the word no and the word more. So that's what was wrong with the city as he walked around. Everything that he saw, all the problems in the built environment, seemed to come from the fact that people only had two words. More of something that they already knew, even if it isn't any good, or no, to stop the process of more when it peters out. So for the commissioner, this had everything to do with language. And the way that you structure language somehow ends up being expressed in the structures in the built environment. And so he says, the issue is safety, not the number of police. The issue is mobility, not highways. The issue is recreation, not parks. Communications, not signs and lighting. The architecture of information, not information about architecture. So there's something about, he believes that the reason the built environment doesn't work is because language, this is my gloss on it, is because, and this is one of the 5 teachings from this body of work that I'd like to share with you today, language generates structure. And Mr. Werman was not the only architect who was talking this way. There's a similarly obscure architect whose written work is at least a little better known. Who of you here have this book or have been influenced by this? Okay, many of us. This is a book by Christopher Alexander called The Timeless Way of Building. Alexander talks about language generating structure, that if we want structures that are, for him, the differences between dead structures and living structures, that the secret to being able to create living structure, that some of that is about words. And he talks about having a pattern language for a project in the built environment, and that the patterns in the language actually generate the structures, these living structures that are good. One example of pattern language from Alexander is intimacy gradient. That if you start a project, or another one is different chairs. How many of you do interiors and have to design conference rooms where all of the chairs are the same? That ends up being an act of design oftentimes, but Alexander is saying architecturally, the structures that we end up with are generated out of the language we use. And if we had this piece of this pattern in our language called different chairs, the structures that we would make would be different. If we had a pattern called intimacy gradient, the way that the space works, this would be a better place because intimacy has to happen over a gradient. So this idea that language generates structure. The Commissioner of Curiosity and Imagination goes on. This is a sequel that came out in 2009. He talks about this problem where designers and architects and technicians in the initial stages of a problem, wondering how they're going to do it, is happening before they know what they are going to do. And so this idea, language generates structure. The way that we talk about things impacts what we build. I was curious to know, Mr. Worman has self-published 93 books. He's only worked for 2 people, Louis Kahn and Charles Eames. He's not known to be a good collaborator. But I wanted to know, so you can look at, do his teachings result in things that are good? You can look at his 93 books, all of which are self-published, most of which are out of print. But I wanted to look in the built environment when he was an architect. How do these things start to play out? Here's an image of a project that he built in 1970 on Long Beach Island in New Jersey. This is about an hour and a half from New York City, and it's an island made of sand. And does language generate structure, was my question. And getting back to this Commissioner of Curiosity and Imagination saying, well, a lot of the problems that we have in structures that aren't good is they result from a language that only includes more of the same or no. These were called sandcastles. And aren't they? If you only had more, so I drove around, there's one of these left, drove around Long Beach Island looking at all of the other structures. If you only had the ability to do more of what was already there, or to say no to the things that you didn't like, you would never have gotten to these remarkable sandcastles. In 1971, they were published in Look magazine, and sadly today, only one of them remains, and it is probably the least charming one, and it's been altered in some ways that detract from its sandcastliness, or the apparent sandcastliness of this structure. If you look at what was built in the place of the other 3, so before we go and make a judgment here, how would you know which is the better architecture? Especially comparing the original state of these. So 4 families, they have a small piece of beachfront property. They want to be able to live together, but they want their privacy. So everything from how these things are rotated so that none of the windows look into any of the other windows. The way that some of them are for families with children, and so there is a nursery on the top floor for the ones that have kids. The ones without, there's a circular couch thing in the space up top where the nursery is in the other ones. Language generating structure, and then which, if we were building for my sister, this is probably closer to what she would want than sandcastle. And what Matthew said earlier, actually, about are we shooting for perfection, or are we just shooting to make something be good? How hard is it for you as architects if the range of what you can do in this built place ranges from this to the sandcastles? How do you know what's good? How do you land in the right place? And if you're shooting for perfection, where it either has to be a sandcastle or it has to be whatever we would call this, that's pretty hard. And what Mr. Worman developed a few years before this conference was this idea of, well, performance is that missing language. So if we would never get to sandcastles using more or no, we need some other language. If language generates structure, what is this other language that we can use to make things be good? How would we get to sandcastles if that was the right place to go? What Mr. Worman starts to develop in his work, and the deeper that I look, the more evidence that I see this further and further back in his work, is this idea of performance. This is an interesting photograph. I believe that is Denise Scott Brown over there. He's enjoying a Miller High Life. Performance is the measure of how well our environment responds to our needs and the basis of a common vocabulary for communicating our needs. Performance. So let's not talk about is it pretty or not pretty, or does it meet the function or not meet the function? But is there a language, a rich language of performance that we could use to describe what we will do? Before we're even talking about anything about how we'll do stuff, is there a language we can use to get at what we will do? And he talks about performance, and not just a language of performance, but using this language in terms of continuums. So one of the possible continua that Mr. Werman may have considered in coming up with these sandcastles, how do we want to live? In the town of what if, in the land of could be, when you can only do more or say no, you might be able to hit one or the other ends of this continuum. And it would have to be the magic bullet. It would have to be perfection, and perfection is hard. But life is messy, and communicating our needs is hard. So what if we talked about the performance we want out of the things that we're making, not just in terms of is it this or is it that, but in terms of continuums? Can we describe the performance we're after in terms of continuums? And so if you were to put some numbers on a scale, you could say, where are we now, and where would we like to go? And if you stack up 10 or 15 of these, then you start to develop a rich language to do the next piece of the teaching, which is putting what before how. Louis Kahn was the teacher of Mr. Werman, and pretty much everything that Mr. Werman does can be traced back to what Mr. Kahn did. And it's fascinating to read the words of Louis Kahn. One of the things that he said was that architects don't just take a program from a client and execute it. The way that a pharmacist gets a prescription from a doctor and fills the bottle. Mr. Werman, there's an account on Twitter called Fake Werman. It's a fake account, but the quotes are real. What Mr. Werman once said is that there is another way to talk about this problem that he's addressing with his body of work here is the idea that designers want to start solving the problem. But what about this part about the what? What are we doing? Are we starting on the solution instead of establishing what's true? And for this result, the performance that these families were trying to get out of this project, I believe that you wouldn't have gotten to sandcastles had you not put what before how. If you had the ability to have this conversation, specific, rich conversations, where you're not saying anything about the manner in which it is to be built, nothing about how, but talking exclusively in terms of what. And I think this might be interesting to you all, especially right now. Especially when you can buy software from Frank Gehry that does a lot of the how, or almost all of the how. And not only does the software do the how, and I'm ignorant about this, so I'd love to talk about this with you. My sense is that you can be developing the what simultaneously with the how. When you are tweaking the design, the instructions for construction are being refactored on the fly. It's an orgy of what and how. You can't tell what is which working in that mode. And so one of the teachings from 1976 that didn't implant in your community that I would like to reintroduce you to, or a question, a piece of provocation here is, should architects be putting what before how? An example of the power of putting what before how, the solutions you could get to once you start doing the how. If you have done a rigorous process around what, an example from nearby, Michigan Stadium. What happens on football Saturdays to people who are alumni, to people like Matthew who live in this town? I, as an undergraduate, working at a bike shop on a football Saturday, the doors open in the back, you hear the marching band. You start to get a little crazy with these feelings, with this meaning of what does the the tradition of Michigan football, what does it mean? It means a lot to us. And if you search the Go Blue hashtag during a football game, you will see endless expressions of this. My son, this morning on the way to school. So if we separate what and how, we can get to some extraordinary results. And I think it's dangerous, the kinds of results that we can get from separating what from how. Robert Venturi, I believe, did this in Ann Arbor with the stadium. Does anybody remember this? The halo. It cost $100,000 to take it down. And purportedly the letters, the 7-foot-tall letters, big as life, that are spelling out the words to that fight song. And these words, conquering heroes, victors valiant, champions of the West. Powerful, powerful words. And it had to be taken down. And my argument with this is, you know, in The Tempest, Caliban doesn't know he's a monster until he sees a mirror. And this process that Mr. Worman talked about in 1976, that he got from Louis Kahn, that I believe Robert Venturi picked up from Louis Kahn, turns out that Venturi was Kahn's teaching assistant during the time that Richard Saul Worman was Kahn's pupil. Dangerous, this ability to get at what is the, and if we separate the discussion about what, if you were to take an x-ray to my heart, the feelings that I feel about the traditions of Michigan football, and if you do that with the people in that community, you would get to a halo. I think that halo was good, but it was a mirror held up to the vividness of our irrational fandom, the way that we embrace conquering heroes. Unacceptable. It had to go away. Mr. Venturi's work has been fascinating to me in this context. So not only does language generate structure, not only is there some sort of powerful secret to putting deliberation about what outside of conversations that include how. Not only is that powerful, but the other thing that Mr. Worman examined or exhibits in this body of work called the Architecture of Information that I think he shares with Venturi is a love of complexity. Less is a bore. His critique, Venturi's critique of the international style in that book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, he talks about Philip Johnson's Glass House and how if you take everything out of the program, you can come up with a lovely thing. And then he looks at the Wiley House, which was a commission that Johnson also built, which had to have people living in it, where you cannot subtract the complexion and the contradictory aspects of life, the complexity of wanting a home that is a certain way, but yet is comfortable. The Wiley House is not something that anybody knows about because it is not a very good building. With Mr. Worman, this is a little later than 1976, but it's part of that same body of work. Mr. Worman is talking about the same thing. For Mr. Worman, it isn't, he left architecture in 1977, so for him, it's not about making the built environment be good. For him, he switched his focus to understanding. But similarly, I think for Mr. Worman, when it comes to communications, that we're not taking things away, that real life, to make things be good in real life, you can't take stuff out of the game before you play it. That stuff has to stay in there. That sounds a lot to me like the messy vitalities that Mr. Venturi was talking about. Elsewhere, Worman elaborates on this further. Understandable does not mean that you take out the complexity. Making it clear does not mean that you simplify. The way that Venturi talks about complexity and contradiction as virtues, not vices. And even talking about how when this complexity becomes so heavy that you have to break order, where you have parts that don't fit, Rather than taking those parts out, leave them in. Those are the places where you will actually begin to understand the building, is the places where the order is intentionally broken. So both of these guys, and this is the third of the 5 teachings, is a love of complexity, an embracing of complexity as part of what architecture is supposed to be about. An example, a counterexample, kind of the same modality to Johnson's Glass House and then the Wiley House would be, does anybody have $650,000 extra dollars, by the way? This is for sale. I think my business partner Bob is here. I think this would be a fantastic place for us to live and move our business, but it's in Philadelphia, and we're in Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids. But this is the Fisher House. This is the first project Richard Saul Wurman worked on after coming back from a boondoggle of a project where Mr. Kahn sent him to England to build a barge that a symphony would play on with no money and no working drawings when he was 23 years old. When Mr. Wurman tells this story in the film My Architect by Louis Kahn's son. It's a charming story, but this is the Fisher House. And this thing changed. The plan for this changed over the 7 or 8 years that it was in the office. The complexity and contradiction of how do you get a medical practice, Mr. Fisher's medical practice, to cohere, to be separate yet connected with where the family lives. They used to live separately. The Fishers had this beautiful piece of property. Mr. Fisher had the medical office, and then they had the home. They wanted to bring them together. All of the complexity and contradiction of that, how do you do it? It took a long time, and it was Mr. Kahn's office was always on the verge of bankruptcy. Mr. Wurman's office did go bankrupt, or nearly bankrupt. So this may not be a set of examples for a successful business practice, but when it comes to making something that leaves in all of the messiness of actual life and results in structures that are these living, good structures, these guys' work exemplifies this. And I love what Venturi says about how this isn't talking about that thing where people want it to be simple. That sense of aesthetic simplicity. We're not saying throw that away. That's actually, as Venturi argues, that's the result of rigorously dealing with the complexity, is this aesthetic sense of simplicity, but the complexity and contradiction has to stay in. 2 more things. Second to last thing, understanding precedes action. This is related, as you can probably tell, to putting what before how. This is just another way of saying that. If you wanted the Cliff Notes version of this, I think that's what it all boils down to, is putting what before how. In doing this research, both for this talk and also just generally for my own work on this topic, I came across, again, this quote from Mr. Wurman in a book from 1997. And what I realized in reading this, and that's what sort of opened up this information, this architecture of information is a big body of work. I'm an English major, and having read this book from 1997 in the 90s, and then there's this conference called The Architecture of Information, I figured what he was talking about here was that, but no. What he was talking about was his first book, which was published in 1963. This is the origin, at least if he can be believed when he talks about his work. The architecture of information didn't start then in 1976 with the conference for the AIA. It actually started with this publication that he helped make with his architecture students. And I also have a copy of this here that you are welcome to look at. This was a project with his second-year architecture students at the University of North Carolina. And he had them make plasticine models of 50 cities and towns. And here's a map of where the cities and towns are. And he had them make these plasticine models all to the same scale. He actually wanted to teach them about these cities and towns and compare them and talk about them, but couldn't find any maps that were rendered at the same scale. So he had them make plasticine models of 50 cities and towns, all at the same size, and then photograph them all from the same focal height of a camera. So here is Amsterdam, and it lists on the back, founded around 1200, first mentioned in 1275, World Trade Center after the 17th century. And then it has a list on the back of the population growth over time. In 1622, there were 105,000 people in Amsterdam. In 1960, there were 866,000. 50 cities and towns, all rendered to the same scale in plasticine models. And what this allows you to do, so understanding precedes action. If we were going to do anything about cities, here's Manhattan. Here is Amsterdam. Your ability to understand scale, understand, compare what these places are. How do we understand these places? Well, if we had rendered them all at the same scale, if we could understand them, then we could do stuff. And he's still doing this. A couple years ago, he started a project called 1920-21. Has not been completed, but it's a project around the 19 cities in the world with 20 million people in the 21st century. In order to study these cities, and in order to get at solutions, here's another instance of this is understanding precedes action, or put the what before the how. Has anybody been to San Antonio, Texas? The border of San Antonio is vast. It is actually the largest metropolitan area in the United States because of how its border is drawn. If you were trying to build something or trying to plan a city, and you were using San Antonio as a comparison, how do you even start to do that? The way that cities measure, the way that they create, the way they architect the information about cities is different from every city. So in order to take on a big problem, what if we separated the what from the how? Before we start talking about poverty or food or transportation or net zero, can we separate what from the how? And if the what is, my beautiful daughter, when she's 95, this needs to be a good place still. That conversation is a more powerful conversation than the one that's all mixed up with the tactics of how you're going to get there. Another way that Mr. Werman talks about this, and this is about to the fifth principle here, the creative organization of information creates new information. The way that talk about the organization of information. There are 49 more cities in here. Here's Moscow. Or just a little piece of Moscow, actually. The University of North Carolina had a book series. It cost $2. It came out periodically. In order to make this thing, Mr. Werman put the what before the how, and rather than saying, oh, well, we could take all this nifty student work with all these plasticine models and put it into the book that you publish, that would be neat. So, well, does it have to be a book? Could it be a special double issue? And instead of costing $2, which I can't do this project for a $2 publication, but what if we made it a double issue and it cost $4 and we had twice as much time? Then you can make something like this. So not only does understanding precede action leads to different outcomes, there is meaning encoded in those decisions about how you're ordering things. So the meaning of this, expressed in this modality. In 1971, Mr. Werman published a small book with small reproductions of these photographs. Doesn't work. People were curious about it, so they needed access to it, and a cheap edition. These are impossible to find. I believe this one was stolen from a library. 1,200 of them were made. Same thing with the artifact from the conference. 1,200 were made. There's no Library of Congress number for these things. Putting the what before the how, and then this last teaching, order encodes meaning. The way that you put the parts together here says something about what this endeavor is about and what it means. Mr. Venturi talks about this in the built environment in terms of architecting the parts. If you take conventional parts and put them together in an unconventional way, that's how we create meaning. If you take unconventional parts and put them together in a conventional way, that also has a different sense of meaning. And one of the things I love about his work was the sort of landing on this, is when it comes to architectural form, if you're putting what before how, if understanding precedes action, many of you know he recommends against ever making ducks. It's very dangerous to make a duck, and you could even maybe argue that the sandcastles were a duck. where the form is inextricably linked to the meaning. And then here's a decorated shed that my sister would much prefer to live in. So that is the power of this idea that order encodes meaning. And back to how Mr. Worman talked about it, he provided this thought experiment and said, if I went to the manufacturer of stuffed animals and said, make me a male and a female of every one of the 350 or so AKC breeds, let me reorganize those things and I will create all sorts of different meanings. If I take all of the females from the sporting breeds and line them up next to all of the males, that means something. That allows us to understand something different. If we take what are the most popular dogs and we take them next to the least popular dogs, the dogs never change, but order encodes meaning. And so the question for us, toward what? If we were able to talk about, if we could separate how we're going to do something from what it should be, this choice of modality, where we end up with the physical expression, can be more accurate, more powerful, better, all those kinds of superlatives. So those are the 5 principles from this body of teachings that you all have dibs on still as members of the AIA. And the way that I'd like to sort of summarize and then open it up for conversation if we have time is, what is the difference between architects and designers? And maybe that this is related to this question of putting what before how. I'm just curious to know, how many of you here sort of self-identify as a designer? Put your other hand up if you also identify as an architect. Interesting. Okay. One of the ways that you can sort of talk about communities of practice, this is sort of a munge between community theory and mathematics, is sort of talking about bounded and centered sets. Architecture is a bounded set. You are not permitted, and in some of my conversations before getting up here, in introducing myself as an information architect, it's like, yeah, I don't like it how you use that word. This was said to me in numerous contexts, and I appreciate that because you belong to a bounded set. The matters of architecture, not just anybody can do that. Design, on the other hand, is a centered set. And sort of the way that these models work is, the idea is, you're a member of the centered set if you're a cat facing the pail. It doesn't matter how far away from the pail you are, just being in the right direction. Design is the milk, let's say, and all of us cats can be designers based on, are we pointing in the direction or not? But you can't be in the cage with this cat because this cat has a license. That's a bounded set. Mr. Worman says that design is how you do things. And what he doesn't come out and say, but I think the totality of his work says it, is that architecture is the what. And it's, of course, a false dichotomy. And with my students, when I talk about this, I talk about a Mobius strip. So if I take a strip of paper and write architecture on one side, flip it over, write design on the other side, twist it and tape it, there are parts of that Mobius strip that are clearly, singularly the architecture part. There are other parts that are clearly, singularly the design part. And then there's the twisty bits at the side where you don't know. It's not that architecture and design have to be separate things. What I wonder about is this set of teachings that Mr. Worman gave you all back in 1976 about the difference, and that if we did the architecture stuff as the what, and then we do design as the how, that there may be a powerful set of outcomes. Powerful in terms of, can we then make sandcastles instead of just more of the same? But then there's also the questions of identity and the value of your practice. I took a look at sort of, so what are the boundaries of this set for architects? And only the thing in yellow, the yellow thing can't be done by this. But these other things, you used to be able to draw and make models. You used to have to be able to reconcile structures with gravity and entropy and those types of forces. You used to have to reconcile your design with the properties of the materials that you wanted to use. You used to have to be able to generate working drawings. Those were boundaries to architecture. not so much anymore, at least as I observe it from the outside, and I'd love to hear pushback on that. So the idea of this set of teachings, it operates independently of modality. So you all working in the built environment, I work with computer systems, information systems. The work that we do as architects doesn't have to be on a computer. And in some ways, separating out the work that we do out of the computer might be part of helping clients understand that we have separated the what from the how. The client can't do a fly-through of the loofah sponges on the toothpicks. With a physical model, you get to talk about what separately from how you're actually going to do it. And so maybe boiling it down, that is where it all lands, is putting what before how. Maybe we could talk about the pipe without having it to always be an actual pipe all the time. And the one sort of thing that obtains in both contexts is we need the right client. Because even if you do use a model, maybe the client doesn't understand that. So that is all I have for you right now. And instead of boos or applause, I would like a question. Or objections. I actually like objections better. Yes?
It's interesting you end with the pipe. That pipe is often used by the CA as a symbol of perfect industrialized object.
I didn't know that the tobacco pipe.
That pipe,
Okay.
that image right there.
That image.
Literally, that image. And Corbusier often said that a great architect, that is, he understands the thing before the beginning part.
Well, and that is Louis Kahn also, right? The what has been always will be, wanting to, Kahn said he had this multi-volume history of England on his shelf, and he could start reading volume 1, but then he had to stop because what he really wanted to read was volume 0. What before how? Before we even get to talking about light poles, what if we're talking about illumination or safety or some other first principle? Yes?
Service does your business.
What service does my business provide? What do I do? That is a great question. Sometimes, so one of the tools that we use in almost every project is this performance continuum that Mr. Worman came up with. So let's see if I can find it. So we had a client who we will just call Publishing Co. Publishing Co. has profound disruption to their business model, profound disruption to everything. And Publishing Co. is going digital. And rather than bringing in the digital folks and wheeling out the analog folks, we have both sets of people. And so the stakeholders for the project, for what kinds of things is Publishing Co. going to do with its website and such, the people who are making those decisions are both old school print people and new school digital people. In order to give them a plan, so I think the short answer is, and to use we can't call it programming in working with computer systems. That's even worse than calling something architecture. Programming is how, writing code in our world. But in your world, programming, that is mostly what my company provides, is guidance. So with Publishing Co., figuring out what are these, and then working with their stakeholders to gather evidence of a process that would result in knowing what to do. That's the value that we try to provide. And we use a tool like this, and for most projects, we're working for a big healthcare system in Grand Rapids right now, redesigning their intranet, sort of internal systems, and their public-facing website. On each side of that project, we have about 10 to 15 of these continuums. And through listening and understanding the people who are paying for it all, and then talking with the users of it, sort of coming up with where should we be on 16 different of these dimensions with the work that we do. That was a long answer.
What do you do?
Well, here's the thing is I used to call it web design. That was kind of the shortcut for my mom or for people. What do you do? Oh, design. But again, back to, is design how you do something? Because for me, I used to be able to do things. As a younger practitioner, when the web was exploding in like 1996, I could code web pages and I could write database queries. Most of what I did up until I started getting interested in Mr. Werman's work was about how. I knew how to make a layout for information on a web page that was more legible than what the engineer could do. I was trained as a librarian, so I knew how to organize information in ways that made it a little more plausible that you could use it or find it than if an engineer did it. But now the value that we bring, and we're still calling it information architecture, but our approach is much more about sort of what I shared with you. Could we, before we talk about any technology, can we help you plan what would be good? Can we give you some structures that, can we figure out whether you need a duck or a decorated shed? And then can we rough that into a point where a visual designer and a computer person can then make it be built? Yes?
How do you suggest that we look at such a structured design, rules, regulations?
Yep.
We have building code. How do you go from the what, create it, apply it, in a very complex world of the how?
That's a good question. And I suspect that using these computer models, if you do blend your what and your how, the use of computer models would help you understand whether or not you were complying with codes earlier on in the process. Is that a fair statement, would you say? Is if you were using software?
Doesn't that dampen what?
Maybe one way to respond to your question would be to go back to the picture of the Mobius strip. One of the architects who I'm interested in now as a thinker, and a little less so from, I don't like his buildings all that much, just an amateur, so what do I have? Peter Eisenman. I heard somebody say, oh God. So Peter Eisenman gave a speech at his alma mater, which I think is Cornell. Is that right? Does that sound right to people? Colleges of architecture are rebranding as colleges of art and design. There's something about the SCAD or the CAD or something. They like the way the acronym looks. So many of them are rebranding, and they brought Eisenman into his alma mater, who's considering this name change. And he gives this cantankerous talk called Architecture and Design. Wither the difference. He spelled wither the kind of shriveled up way, not the either or way. Kind of polemical, but he talks about the difference between architecture and design as, and I think he's a lot like Robert Venturi in this regard. Architecture is about the search for exceptions. And then if you find where all the exceptions are, then you line up the exceptions toward a goal or something. And then design is this process of synthesis. Once you have identified all the exceptions and you've ordered them, sort of assigning where all the parts go, then design makes the parts be the best parts that they can be. One instance of that I use is, if you've seen this movie, I referred to it earlier, My Architect. It's on Netflix. It's quite a fascinating film by Louis Kahn's son. There's footage in that film of Louis Kahn at the building of the Kimball Museum with a little hard hat on, pointing at the things in the ceiling. And then they cut over to the engineers, these good old boys, and they're incredulous. They're like, what is he still doing here? Like, the architecture is done, and he's talking about, should it be a cap nut screw or this? They're scandalized by it. And he was working on the design. The architecture had been accounted for in how many of those coves, an empty one at the end, but then the design work is still going on, which is how do we make this light mechanism actually work? I bet when he was detailing the light thing, he found flaws in the architecture. and so what value do information architects bring? We help sort of assign what the parts of a system are, and the concept, sort of the society among the parts. And then designers work with those parts. And the designers working with these parts that we have architected will find flaws in the architecture. And that's where this comes in. Then there's sort of a refactoring process of, hey, I'm a designer. I'm working on this part that the architect indicated because he said this was a part, and that was a part, and that was a part. I can't make this part be good because he or she made the assignment of the part in the wrong place. So we need to put those parts back into one big part and recut them or something. So separating the conversation about what from the conversation about how doesn't mean that you have to put them in Ziploc bags and that they don't. There's a lot of symbiosis there. Yes?
Thinking about that Louis Kahn, process. And basically saying that you're the guy that your wife.
Yeah.
But
Well, and time. I mean, it's true.
But our doing there's not generation line. That in itself. So I remember that year of obviously one of which program reads. Then there were an awful lot of the jurors. That was a different.
Yeah, anytime that you're using sort of maxims and principles that come from people whose businesses have failed, yeah, warn, to take it with some caution, but at the same time, generationally, if the tools that we use make no affordance for the how part being any different than the what part, then maybe the message is we don't have to take 7 years, the Fisher House. But at the same time, if we started with what it looks like and then sort of reverse engineer what it means, if we could set aside, you can't, and especially in your work, with our work, you can set aside the what it looks like part longer. And you can also, after the metaphorical cement is poured on the really hard to change parts of the stuff that we work on, you can still change it all the time. The cement is no different from cardboard in our world. So it's been more important in some ways for us to separate what and how, because in software and with no consequences of buildings collapsing, in web design in particular, no separation between what and how, always talking about things in terms of how they look. And that world wants to move quite rapidly. So I think it's less of a, hey world, you're in the wrong world, and we're going to do something that doesn't fit inside of you. I think, and that's where I love what Venturi does with the embrace of complexity and contradiction. Like, no, we'll accept that this is hard, that you have to suffer for architecture. But separating the what, even if you did it at different parts of the day, even if we said we can't look at the architects. Mr. Orman was honored this year by the Cooper Hewitt National Design. It's a long thing. with a Lifetime Achievement Award. But the awardees this year for architecture were Billy Sen and Todd Williams. They talk about withholding an elevation from their clients as long as you cruelly, insistently, and they're also known for slow, right? So this doesn't. I'm not. I should put the shovel down maybe, but what they do. So they're, of course, the client gets to see the elevation at some point. But if you could show it and you don't, for a time, because you would like to talk about what instead of how, because as soon as they see the little person next to the thing, they're going to thin slice it and think they know what it is. So tactics of protecting our own time, and maybe this isn't something that clients even know about, that we have taken the trouble to separate one. Maybe this is just for us. If we take the morning and we can't show any elevations and no pictures and no computer, what if we just had markers? And then in the afternoon we'll go into Reddit and we'll does anybody here make physical models anymore? I'm curious to know if what I'm talking about makes any sense to you as a maker of physical models in a world where there are digital models concurrent. Tape. Cut the sponge, make 2 trees.
Find that I feel very a lot. I find that anytime I sketch anything engages by far more than we do both. But it engages them still something they're imagining.
Back to the commissioner of curiosity and imagination. Anybody here a digital native who struggles with non-digital artifacts in your process? Because I don't know that this is saying you need to introduce some sort of an analog piece. I don't think you need to do that at all to separate what from how, or to momentarily be mindful of one mode.
Back to the comment on hand-drawn client statement. The client you see it hand-drawn. I think they see that artist, artistic side. That's probably where I would also mention, this is, and we came back from the time we're going to talk about the AIA, and they're looking, the first thing it says
Beyond bricks and mortar. Yeah, I was curious to watch the dot coding.
Yeah, they're thinking about, hey, architects of just historically we've done buildings, but architects in our built environment, we're part of society, discussion, the dialogue. There's so many facets for architects beyond the mortar today, and our practices. So even our national organization, where are we going? And this whole idea of you have to be a licensed architect. There is other classifications. Broader.
And I'm ignorant, is that currently a prerequisite for membership in the Institute, is being a licensed architect?
No, you can be associate member category, but be an architect in AIA. You have
Yeah, so far my community of practice does not have any licensure at all. Anybody can call themselves. Even me.
We're going after people who say architect too, but I'm just kidding.
We know. Actually, no. Well, the Information Architecture Institute, actually, we're an international organization. And there are places where we have members where we would not be permitted to advertise with the word architect.
Technically,
well, and there's some nuance here because if we were advertising for services that are situated in the marketplace of the built environment, that's kind of the way that we've sort of wiggled our way out of it. But back to that idea of bounded and centered sets, if anyone can be a designer. But there is a boundary around architecture. There's a license that's a boundary around it, but there are other aspects of what you that act as that boundary. Yes? Why don't we call it information design? Is anybody here familiar with Edward Tufte? He calls himself an information designer. And that's a complex question. The short answer is the reason we call it information architecture is because some librarians in Ann Arbor in the late 90s called it that, and people paid money for it. Way more than they would have paid for something called librarianship, which was basically what these guys were offering. So by calling it information architecture, they were valued more highly and were able to command a nicer fee. But today, we can choose, Bob and I, when we started our company, we could choose to call it design or architecture. And for us, it's wanting to be the folks who are more on the what is it side, and less on the what does it look like side. Many of the people in our company have backgrounds in design disciplines who became frustrated by the subjectivity of doing design work in commercial context, where I don't think it's pretty, I do think it's pretty. Information architecture was a way for a lot of those people to, and not calling it design, but calling it architecture, to be focused more on, this isn't what it looks like, this is what it is, this is what it's about, and this is what it means. Other people will take care of what it looks like. And so, for a lot of us, the choice to not say design is, A, we want this sense of a bounded set, like not just anybody can do this, but also this sense of designers are ordering. Charles Eames said design is the ordering of materials toward a goal. We want to work before the goal has been set. We want a piece of the conversation of what is the goal. And not by saying, let's take out all of the things that make setting a goal hard. But no, let's leave all that in. And then another way that we talk about it is we work with designers all the time. We hire them in to help us with our process. Clients need to see our work. And designers want to put a straw dog on the table as soon as possible and then start shaking that dog into the actual dog. And my colleagues and I are sitting there, it has to be a dog. It has to be a dog. Maybe it could be 2 puppies and a cat. Yes?
I don't have a problem with using architecture. In fact, if you did like a scholar's vast
Oh, yes.
that don't relate to building architecture.
Well, I was surprised, actually. You can dig into, there's this thing called Google Trends, which is where I pulled this from. And this is narrowed to Michigan. But you can see inside of that broad thing of architecture, what are the things that they're looking for? And at least according to Google Trends, the top 10 searches for architecture are about the built environment. The top 10 searches that have information architecture in them are all over. Yes?
There's two parts. One, that there isn't a direct idea. This notion of truth, finding is not such a. And also, architects do that, maybe allow them. Because we deal with who don't have grow up with not only order, matter of actual word, relate.
We know too much, oftentimes, about the process that we're taking somebody through. One of the things that Mr. Werman celebrates is his ignorance, and celebrates the idea of understanding what it's like to not understand. And yeah, when we become familiar with the process that yields the results that we like when we work with clients, oftentimes there's a whole bunch of language in there that they don't understand. And part of this putting the what before the how and this focus on language, and if you believed, which I think has just been posited here, I don't know if anybody believes this, but that the words that you use with them, when you are coming at what will we do, that those words are co-responsible for the generation of the structure along with the visual piece of your brain as the architect who's going to render a structure. So being careful with those words. If you read Mr. Werman's work, finding an instance of a 3-syllable word is hard. He and Louis Kahn would have a contest to see who could do it dumber.